Principles of modern slavery controls 1. Economic coercion of slaves to permanent work. The modern slave is forced to work non-stop until death. Because the money earned by a slave in 1 month is enough to pay for housing for 1 month, food for 1 month and travel for 1 month. Since the modern slave always has enough money for only 1 month, the modern slave is forced to work all his life until death. The pension is also a big fiction, because a retired slave pays his entire pension for housing and food. And a retired slave has no spare money. 2. The second mechanism of hidden coercion of slaves to work is the creation of an artificial demand for pseudo-necessary goods, which are imposed on the slave with the help of TV advertising, PR, the location of goods at certain places in the store. The modern slave is involved in an endless race for novelties, and for this he has to constantly work. 3. The third hidden mechanism of economic coercion of modern slaves is the credit system, with the help of which modern slaves are more and more drawn into credit bondage, through the mechanism of loan interest. 4. The fourth mechanism for making modern slaves work for the hidden slave owner is the myth of the state. The modern slave thinks that he works for the state, but in fact the slave works for the pseudo-state, because the money of the slave goes into the pocket of the slave owners. And the concept of the state is used to cloud the brains of the slaves so that the slaves do not ask unnecessary questions such as, why do slaves work all their lives and remain always poor? And why don't the slaves have a share of the profits? And to whom exactly is the money paid by the slaves in the form of taxes transferred? 5. The fifth mechanism of hidden coercion of slaves is the mechanism of inflation. The rise in prices in the absence of an increase in the wages of a slave provides a hidden, imperceptible robbery of slaves. Thus, the modern slave becomes more and more impoverished, and the accumulations of slaves are burned out every year. What makes slaves get into mortgages? 6. The sixth hidden mechanism to make a slave work for free, to deprive the slave of funds for moving and buying real estate in another city or another country. This mechanism forces modern slaves to work at one city forming enterprise and endure enslaving conditions, because the slaves simply do not have other conditions and the slaves have nothing and nowhere to run away. 7. The seventh mechanism that makes the slave work for free is the concealment of information about the real value of the slave's labor, the real value of the goods that the slave produced, and the share of the slave's salary, which the slave owner takes through the accounting mechanism. Taking advantage of the ignorance of the slaves and the lack of control of the slaves over the surplus value that the slave owner takes for himself. 8. In order for modern slaves not to demand their share of the profit, they did not demand to give back what they earned by their fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers, great-great-grandfathers, etc. It is the silence of the facts of plundering into the pockets of slave owners of resources that were created by numerous generations of slaves over a 1,000-year history. Means of suppressing resistance. Now let's list the means that suppress the energy of resistance in slaves. And what is it? Resistance energy? This is when the slave sees that life is and wants to change something but does not know how and does not understand anything. And here the authorities have at the ready the means of suppressing the energy of resistance. 1. Ethyl alcohol intoxicates the slave, brings in him a false sense of happiness. We brutally suppress the energy of resistance, turns into a stupid BIOROBOT, work, alcohol, weekend oblivion, work and so on until painful death. The slave completely ceases to think, slowly killing at the same time. It was imposed in a special way by the Jews in the occupied territory. The German occupiers Romanovs became Russified and began to reduce the consumption of alcohol in Ingushetia from 1860 to 1917. But international Jidai came and not only increased, but also turned Russiches into pigs with a consumption share of more than 10 liters. The process was launched into the final stage of degradation by the Trotskyist Khrushchev. As a result, Russians are degraded both mentally and physically. 2. Cigarettes. It is also a drug imposed by the Jidai to suppress the local population. Reduces lifespan. Together with alcohol, we greatly undermine the health of the slave, so that the slaves do not live up to retirement age. And the pension was a forced notion. Because the slaves living in Klopovniki cannot feed their old people, they themselves are barely enough to feed. 3. Illegal drugs. The Jidai introduced the hard drugs